The reports are in. If it wasn't obvious before, it's certainly obvious now. The August LSAT revealed that LSAC is, in fact, increasing the proportion of formal logic questions on the LSAT. These are questions involving conditional reasoning, more questions involving numbers and percentages as well. I'll walk you through all the recent changes and what they mean for you if you're taking the LSAT in September or beyond. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. And 2024 is a year unlike any other in the LSAT world because it is the year where LSAC removed the logic game section and replaced it with a second scored logical reasoning section. This was the result of a lawsuit several years back, which LSAC settled in 2019. They were sued by a blind test taker who contended that he was at an unfair disadvantage on the LSAT because he couldn't benefit from diagramming in logic games the way other test takers could, which is a pretty fair point if you ask me, because I don't know if you've seen logic games, but if you try solving them without diagramming, it's not going to be a walk in the park. In fact, I personally could not solve them without diagramming. LSAC settled that lawsuit and agreed to develop a new version of the test without the logic games section that existed on the LSAT at the time. LSAC played around with a couple of different formats of potential logic games replacements. They ultimately just decided to remove the logic games section and replace it with a second scored logical reasoning section. However, in the past year or so, the logical reasoning experimental sections, however, told a different story. They indicated that LSAC is including more formal logic, more conditional reasoning, and more questions involving numbers and percentages. They were testing those out ever since at least November of 2023, and we have finally seen some of those questions appearing on the official scored portions of the LSAT on this past August LSAT, and the logical reasoning experimental sections include an even higher percentage of these formal logic questions. What this indicates is that while LSAC is technically adhering to the terms of the joint settlement agreement with the plaintiff's attorneys, the ones who sued LSAC for discrimination on the logic game section, it seems that LSAC may not be adhering to the spirit of the agreement, in that while they are technically removing the logic game section, they are testing similar concepts where diagramming could be useful on the logical reasoning section. Now, perhaps logical reasoning questions are not as prone to diagramming as logic games questions are, but there's no doubt that for a lot of these questions, creating a diagram would likely be helpful. Now, these questions involve lots of concrete diagrammable statements, questions that seem to be, on the surface at least, a bit similar to logic games questions. And for specific question types you might want to look into, this is including inference questions, which includes must be true, most strongly supported, cannot be true, and must be false, sufficient assumption questions, and parallel reasoning questions. And even flaw questions as well could involve a bit of formal logic. So if you're looking for some examples of questions on previous LSATs of these types, I'll share a couple of examples with you here. Note here that the prep test numbering I'm using is the old format just because I'm a lot more familiar with it. I have all this knowledge in my head from the past 20 or so years of teaching the LSAT on that old numbering system for prep tests 1 to 94. If you are using the new numbering system from 101 to 158, you may need to Google the question to convert to the new format. But that being said, here are my examples. From prep test 30, there's a question involving inspired musical performances, lots of conditional statements, diagramming clearly useful in this case. This was an inference question. From prep test 44, we have a flaw question involving numbers and percentages with Clara Schumann, who plays the piano. We have in prep test 53, a parallel reasoning question involving April rainfall, where diagramming is useful. And from prep test 58, we had a sufficient assumption question involving handmade wigs. I would consider all of these questions, these 4 examples here, to involve conditional reasoning and or numbers and percentages, aka quantitative reasoning. These questions appeared here and there on the LSAT, so LSAC is technically telling the truth when they say they are not including some radical new question type to replace the logic game section. However, it is still quite clear that LSAC does, in fact, want to test the concepts previously tested on the logic game section, on the logical reasoning section, and while these questions were always on the LSAT in the past, the increased prevalence of these questions going forward indicates that LSAC does not feel that only including a couple of them per section is sufficient to test these concepts to the degree they would like to test them. And so if you are taking the LSAT in September or beyond, make sure you brush up on these formal logic, conditional reasoning, and quantitative reasoning type questions, including inference, flaw, parallel, and sufficient assumption, which may appear a bit more than they have in the past. And if you'd like my help whenever you're taking the LSAT, there are a variety of ways I can support you. At LSAT Unplugged, we offer live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching. You can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.